The room was not supposed to be occupied. That was the first thing. The east corridor of Windsor Castle on a January afternoon in 1998 was not on anyone's schedule. It was not a room where things happened. It was a room people passed through on the way to rooms where things happened. And so, nobody had thought to check it. Nobody had thought to warn her. Nobody had thought in the particular way that people fail to think about things that seem impossible until they aren't, that this was a moment that needed to be anticipated. The Queen was not supposed to be in that corridor at that hour. Camilla Parker Bowles was not supposed to be in that room, and Diana's tiara was not supposed to be on anyone's head. What the Queen said when she walked through that door has never been repeated publicly. But the woman who was standing 3 feet away when it happened has never forgotten it. She said that in 30 years of service to the royal family, she had never heard the Queen use that particular tone of voice. Not angry, not shocked, something colder than both. The kind of voice, she said, that arrives when someone has already decided something, and the scene in front of them has simply confirmed what they knew. She said the room went completely silent. She said Camilla did not move for a long moment. She said the tiara caught the light as it was lifted from her head, and that the Queen watched it happen without blinking. To understand what that moment meant, you need to understand the 18 months that preceded it. You need to understand what 1997 had done to that family, to that institution, and to the particular silence that had settled over Windsor in the weeks and months after August. And you need to understand what Diana's things meant, not as objects, not as possessions, but as the remaining physical evidence of a person who was no longer there to speak for herself. Diana had died on the 31st of August, 1997. She was 36 years old. The days that followed were unlike anything the royal family had navigated before. The public grief was enormous, specific, directed. The flowers outside Kensington Palace, the queue that stretched for miles, the book of condolences that filled and was replaced and filled again. The world had decided, in the particular way the world decides things, that Diana had been something irreplaceable, that her loss was personal, that it belonged to everyone who had ever felt seen by her in a photograph or a handshake or the particular quality of her attention when she knelt beside someone the rest of the world preferred not to touch. The royal family stood inside that grief and managed it the way they managed everything, with composure, with protocol, with the institutional steadiness that had carried them through worse, or so they told themselves and perhaps believed. But inside the composure, things were shifting. Charles and Camilla had been together in the open now for some time, not officially. There was no language for it yet, no title, no ceremony, no acknowledgement from the institution that had spent years pretending the relationship did not exist, but they were no longer pretending. After Diana died, the particular pretense that had structured so much of those years dissolved, and what was left was simply the fact of them. Two people who had been in each other's lives for decades, now standing in the open in the rubble of something that had cost everyone enormously. Camilla understood the situation. She was not a careless woman. She had moved through difficult rooms for years with the composure of someone who had made peace with complexity and learned to carry it without showing the weight. She understood that 1997 had changed the coordinates of everything, that the public feeling about Diana was raw and enormous, and that her own position in relation to that feeling was, to put it carefully, delicate. She was careful. She was measured. She gave very little away. But there were moments. There are always moments when the management slips just slightly, just for long enough. January of 1998 was one of those moments. Windsor Castle in January had a specific quality. The Christmas gathering had dispersed. The particular machinery of the holiday, the schedule, the speech, the formal dinners, the family assembled under one roof with all the complications that implied, had wound down, and the house had returned to itself. The staff moved through quieter corridors. The light through the windows was gray and flat in the particular way of English winter. There was a stillness to the place that January always brought, a collective exhalation after the concentrated effort of December. Camilla had come to Windsor with Charles for what was described as a private visit. This was not unusual. She had been coming with increasing frequency since the summer. She moved through the house with the particular ease of someone learning its rhythms, its staff, its particular geography of rooms and corridors, and the unwritten rules about which were hers to occupy and which were not. She had been learning. She was good at learning. The room she entered that afternoon was in the East Corridor, a smaller room adjacent to the main dressing rooms, the kind of space that held things rather than hosted people. It had been used in the years of Diana's marriage as a place where certain items were stored between official occasions. Jewelry, accessories, the particular objects that accompanied the life of a working princess and required somewhere to live between engagements. After Diana died, the contents of that room had not been moved. This was not a decision exactly. It was more the absence of a decision. There was, in the months after August 1997, an enormous amount that needed to be decided about Diana's belongings, her estate, her jewelry, the disposition of things that had been royal property, and things that had been hers personally. These decisions were sensitive, they were legal, they were emotional in ways that the institution did not have clean language for. And so many of them had simply been deferred, held in the particular suspension of things that are too complicated to address immediately and too significant to address carelessly. The room remained as it had been, including the tiara. It had been commissioned in 1981, the year of the wedding. Spencer family pieces had been considered, and ultimately a new piece was made, designed specifically for Diana for the occasion of her marriage into the family she was joining. It was the piece she wore on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral on the 29th of July, when 700 million people watched, and the photographs went everywhere, and the world decided collectively that something had begun. She wore it afterward, not constantly, not on every occasion, but at the significant ones, the state banquets, the official portraits, the evenings when the full weight of the role required its full regalia. It had been on her head at moments that were in the public consciousness indelible. It was in the minds of most people who knew anything about it. Hers, not in a legal sense necessarily, but in the sense that matters more than legal, in the sense of association, of belonging. It was sitting in that room on a January afternoon when Camilla walked in. Nobody knows exactly what she was looking for, whether she had wandered in by accident or with some particular purpose, whether she had been in the room before. The staff member who was present had come in from the adjoining corridor and found Camilla already there, standing in front of the glass case that held several pieces, looking at them with the quiet attention of someone who has time and privacy and is using both. She said later that she did not immediately understand what she was seeing. Then she did. Camilla had the tiara in her hands. She was holding it carefully, the particular careful handling of someone who understands what they're touching and is being deliberate about it. And then, in the way that people do things when they believe they are not being watched, she raised it slowly and placed it on her head. The staff member did not move. She said later that she simply could not for a moment make herself do anything, that she stood in the doorway and looked at what was in front of her and felt something she did have a word for, not quite shock, something more like the sensation of watching a law of physics fail, something that was not supposed to be possible happening. Camilla was looking at herself in the mirror on the far wall. She had the particular expression of someone doing something private, something that is only for themselves, the unguarded face of a person who believes they are alone. She tilted her head slightly. The tiara caught the low January light. She did not hear the door behind her. The Queen had been moving through the corridor on her own route, the particular circuit of Windsor that was hers, the private daily geography of a woman who had lived in these buildings for decades and moved through them with the automatic ease of deep familiarity. She was not accompanied. This was not unusual. There were hours of the day when she moved through the private areas of her houses simply as a person moving through rooms without the machinery of attendance and protocol. She came through the door. The staff member saw her arrive. She said the Queen stopped walking immediately, that her face did something she had never seen the Queen's face do before, and could not quite describe afterward. Not anger, not quite. Something that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere more precise and more final. Camilla saw her in the mirror. She said later, to someone she trusted, that it was the worst moment of her life. That she had experienced difficult rooms and difficult silences and difficult conversations in her years, navigating the edges of this family and this institution, but that nothing had prepared her for the specific quality of the silence that fell in that room when their eyes met in the mirror. She lowered her hands. The tiara came off her head. She turned around. The Queen looked at her for a long moment without speaking. When she spoke, she did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The staff member who was present said that the Queen's voice was completely level. the particular level of someone who has decided, before a word is said, exactly what needs to happen and exactly what the parameters of this conversation are going to be. She said two things. The first was a question, not a hostile question, not a sharp one, but the kind of question that is not really a question. The kind that names what has happened by asking about it, and in the naming makes the thing impossible to explain away. She asked Camilla what she was doing. The second thing was not a question. The queen looked at the tiara, which was now in Camilla's hands, and she said that it belonged to Diana. Not in the past tense, in the present. She said that it was Diana's. She said it in the way that certain things are said when they are being established rather than discussed, when the person speaking them is not interested in argument or nuance, or the particular complexity of legal ownership versus personal association. She said it was Diana's, and then she held out her hand. Camilla placed the tiara in the queen's outstretched hand. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The staff member said that the look on Camilla's face was the only time in all the years she had known her that she saw something that looked like being genuinely undone. Not the composed management of difficulty, not the practiced grace of someone who has learned to weather complicated rooms, something more naked than that. The particular expression of a person who has been seen doing something they cannot explain by someone whose judgment of it is final. The queen looked at the tiara in her hand for a moment, then she turned and left the room. She did not say anything further to Camilla. She did not need to. She had said what needed to be said, and she had done what needed to be done, and the conversation was in the particular way the queen ended conversations that were over. Camilla stood in the room alone. The staff member left shortly after. She said she did not look at Camilla again before she went, not from hostility, from the instinct of someone who understood that what had just happened in that room was not for witnesses beyond what had already been witnessed. The tiara was returned to its case that afternoon, a different case in a different location, in a room with a different key. These arrangements were made without explanation, in the quiet way the queen made arrangements when she had decided something. Nobody asked about the change. Nobody needed to. Camilla did not come back to Windsor for 6 weeks. When she did, she was by every account more careful. Not cold, not diminished, but precise in a way that she had not always been. Measured in the particular way of someone who has learned through a single moment exactly where the edges of a territory are and has decided with full clarity to respect them. She never spoke publicly about what happened in that room. The staff member who witnessed it spoke about it once, years later, to someone she trusted, who eventually passed it on in the careful way that certain things are passed on when they are too significant to disappear, but too private to be announced. She said it was not what the queen said that she remembered most. It was the hand, the outstretched hand, the expectation of the tiara being placed in it, without discussion, without negotiation, without the possibility of any other outcome. The absolute quiet confidence of someone who did not need to raise their voice or explain their authority, because their authority was simply the largest fact in the room. She said it was the most complete thing she had ever seen anyone do. There is a particular kind of protection that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with public statements or gestures designed to be recorded. It comes in a quiet corridor on an afternoon nobody scheduled, in a room that wasn't supposed to matter. It comes in a voice that doesn't rise, a hand that simply extends, a sentence spoken in the present tense about someone who is no longer present. It was Diana's. The tiara went back into its case, the room was locked, the corridor was empty again by the time the light through the Windsor windows had faded to the flat dark of a January evening. The queen walked back through her house the way she always walked, steady forward at her own pace. She did not mention it to anyone.